Oh, okay. Okay. Now you see the file normally. That's it?
I don't know. It's showing, yeah, it's showing the file, but there's a cancel window on top. Not sure if that's supposed to be there. But yeah, I think we're seeing what we should be seeing.
Okay. So I will start anyway, and I think that you can understanding what I'm talking about. First of all, I will present myself. I am Professor Bruno Show Borgongino, PhD at Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, Professor of Medieval History at UFPE, and the coordinator of a research group that is named Leon from UFPE. First of all, sorry for my bad English speaking. I have a strong accent, but I'm trying to be understandable for all of you. So the title of my presentation is Theoretical Medievalism and Pre-Modern Condition at Jacques Goody's Critique of Eurocentrism in the Depth of History and the Renaissance, the one or the many. So what I'm going to present here, I want to answer a simple question. First moment, a simple question. How does Jacques Goody employ medievalism in his critique of Eurocentrism? I will analyze one book. In the first time, I thought about analyze two books, The Theft of History and Renaissance, the one or the many, but because of the time, I decided to analyze just The Theft of History. I will use two concepts to analyze this book, theoretical medievalism and pre-modern condition. So, what is theoretical medievalism? What is that pre-modern condition that I am asking here? I am talking about here. That are concepts that I use from two books. First, the first one, the Bruce Holsinger's book, The Pre-Modern Condition, Medievalism and the Making of Theory. In this book, Bruce Holsinger tells us that Middle Ages rhetorically performed by French theorists like Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault, Roland Barthes, and many others to attack modernity. And French theory, modern French theory, often postulates a medieval heritage in modernity. And the other book is The Legitimacy of Middle Ages on the Unwritten History of Theory by Andrew Cole and Van Smith that edited the book. In this book, in the introduction, they say that it's impossible a theory of modernity without reference to the Middle Ages. So theoretical medievalism is a particular kind of medievalism that it's utilized, it is performed by theorists. So what's my point here? What's my perspective? That the pre-modern is a necessary condition to any theory of Eurocentric modernity. So the critique theory of Eurocentrism uses the pre-modern, perform the pre-modern as condition to discriticize. So here I will analyze, as I told, one book, a book written by Jacques Good. But who was Jacques Good? Jacques Good was a British social anthropologist that worked at Cambridge University. He was the author of a lot of books, a lot of papers, and had a very productivity career. So he works was about the interfaces about between orality and literacy, and had some works in foodstuffs and a lot of other things. But in the final of his career, he written about anti-Eurocentric theories. The Theft of History is one of these books that he criticized the Eurocentrism. So, what did Good criticize in this book? First of all, the idea of European exceptionalism, an idea of an Europe that is the first. It's very different from all the world. The second point, the perspective that all the things, all the historical phenomena occurs first in Europe, then in the rest. The third point, an idea of East-West divergence as something transhistorical, that is, East and West is too different in any historical time. So, what is about the theft of history? There is that text from the book. It is in English, but I want to read the Portuguese translation here for the Brazilian audience. So, let me see. O roubo da história do título refere-se à dominação da história pelo Ocidente. Isto é, o passado é conceituado e apresentado de acordo com o que aconteceu na escala provincial da Europa, frequentemente da Europa Ocidental, então imposto ao resto do mundo. Another part of the book. Obviamente, houve muitas conquistas europeias em tempos recentes, mas boa parte delas foi copiada de outras culturas urbanas, como da China. De fato, a divergência entre Oriente e Ocidente, tanto econômica quanto intelectualmente, mostrou-se relativamente recente e pode ser temporária. So, we saw here the central point of the Jacques Goode's book. But what have Middle Ages to do with this reflection, with all these questions that Jacques Goode is showing us? That is the contents of the book. The book is divided in 3 parts. The first one, a sociocultural genealogy. The second one, 3 scholarly perspectives. The third one, 3 institutions and values. So we have 4 chapters that Jacques Goode do his critique of Eurocentrism. That one about feudalism, another one about the theft of institutions, towns, and the university, another one about the appropriation of values, and another one about love. So there is some parts of the book that I am showing here. Another time I will read in Portuguese, but that is the original text in English. So here we go. O colapso do Ocidente não se espalhou para o Mediterrâneo Oriental, em que, em muitos aspectos, cidades como Constantinopla ou Alexandria, com culturas urbanas, continuaram a se desenvolver, especialmente em termos econômicos, como centros de arte, referência para a educação e entrepostos para o comércio, especialmente com o Oriente. The second one. Quanto à natureza progressiva da sociedade europeia durante o período feudal, a produtividade da agricultura ocidental, sem dúvida, se aprimorou ao longo do tempo, mas partindo de um patamar baixo. No entanto, nunca foi nem de longe tão produtiva quanto a cultura irrigada do Oriente Médio ou do norte da África e sul da Espanha, muito menos do extremo Oriente.
5 minutos.
Ok. The third one. A ideia de que os trovadores, quem pela primeira vez fizeram do amor não um pecado, mas uma virtude, deve ser correta para a Europa medieval, mais insustentável de uma perspectiva mundial e ilustra a estreiteza de um ponto de vista literário confinado à literatura ocidental. So, there was, in Middle Ages, some theft of history, according to Jacques Wood. What did West stole? Institutions, technologies, values, emotions. When did West stole all that things? After the fall of Rome and the decline of Western Mediterranean. From whom did the West stole? Not from Africa, but from the East, where there was no decline in the Middle Ages. So what are my conclusions? First of all that Jacques Woods' medieval Europe was a peripheral location at time in the world. The second point, the collapse of Roman Empire had negative effects only in West Mediterranean. The third one, the medieval European progress depended on Eastern developments, and most part of Western medieval inventions had Eastern origins. The last one, Jacques Wood provincialized medieval Europe in his critique of a modern Eurocentric theory. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruno. So, continuing the papers, we're going now to Angela. I'll be very ashamed to admit I don't know how to pronounce her last name.
Weissel.
Angela Weissel and Robert Squillis, which she's professor at Seton Hall University and he's professor at New York University, both in the USA. With you.
Thank you. Our paper is titled Global Medievalism and the Contest of Space, and I'll kick it off and then pass it on to Angela. European medievalism begins with the medievalization of literal space, the transformation of residences like the Duke of Argyll's Inverary Castle, begun in 1746, and Horace Walpole's villa at Strawberry Hill, originally a typical 18th century neoclassical country residence that Walpole recreated as a Gothic fantasy between 1749 and 1776. Over the next century, Gothic Revival architecture became one of the leading styles for public buildings in the United Kingdom. The decision to rebuild the British Houses of Parliament, which had burned down in 1834, in a neo-Gothic style indicated how deeply the taste for medievalism had saturated 19th century England. Designed by Charles Barry and Augustus Pugin and constructed between 1840 and 1876, the Palace of Westminster's references to medieval architecture had political implications that suited both conservative and progressive legislators. The Middle Ages had given England the Magna Carta, 1215, which in the early 19th century was regarded as the foundation of its representative government, its limitations on royal power, and its recognition of individual rights. At the same time, the medieval world was organized on strictly hierarchical grounds, with a hereditary nobility at its apex. It is significant that the chamber occupied by the House of Lords, which you see in the virtual background behind me, the lobby of that building, was much more richly decorated than that occupied by the House of Commons. The medievalization of public space in the British Empire had a nativist edge, declaring a continuity in values and identity with a merry old England that never existed, and assuaging fears of a nascent modernity with a comforting vision of age-old political and racial stability. But the creation of such spaces was not limited to the UK. Rather, Gothic Revival architecture became enmeshed with the Colonial project, British architects evoking the European Middle Ages everywhere the Union Jack flew. One of the most noteworthy instances of Colonial Gothic Revival is the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Terminus in Mumbai, inscribed in 2004 as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Constructed between 1878 and 1887, the railway station was designed by F.W. Stevens and originally named Victoria Terminus, having been officially opened in the year of the Queen's Golden Jubilee. The 408-page nomination dossier prepared by India for what was then called the Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus responds to colonial medievalism from the point of view of what Laura Jane Smith has called the authorized heritage discourse, a relentlessly positive way of construing heritage that informs the global heritage regime. The review committee's decision and brief description of the property, 7 sentences that begin its page on the UNESCO World Heritage website and are reproduced on dozens of tourist sites, includes three references to the structure's hybridity, its combination of European and Indian architectural elements, stating that it, quote, exhibits an important interchange of influences from Victorian Italianate Gothic Revival architecture and from Indian traditional buildings, that it is, quote, an outstanding example of late 19th century railway architecture in the British Commonwealth, characterized by Victorian Gothic Revival and traditional Indian features, and that, quote, its remarkable stone dome, turrets, pointed arches, and eccentric ground plan are close to traditional Indian palace architecture. It is an outstanding example of the meeting of two cultures as British architects worked with Indian craftsmen to include Indian architectural tradition and idioms, forging a new style unique to Bombay. Indeed, while the nomination dossier asked for inclusion based on all 6 UNESCO criteria, the ICOMOS review and subsequent enrollment of the site recognized only the 2 cited above, an important interchange of influences and an outstanding example of the meeting of 2 cultures. The strategy of contesting the colonial character of the structure by insisting that its identity as European medievalism is transformed by the Indian elements incorporated into it runs throughout the nomination dossier. Moreover, the dossier consistently presents the Gothic character of the structure not as a revival of a past style that derives its meaning from a dialogue with a pre-modern past, but as an emblem of modernity. The identification is not subtle, as when the dossier states, quote, Bombay became prosperous in the mid-19th century, and the Gothic Revival style was employed in Bombay, a distant part of empire, to express signs of modernity. Words like modern and modernity appear nearly 40 times in the dossier, while the term Middle Ages appears not at all, and medieval only 4 times, twice as part of the description of Stevens' building as based on late medieval Italian models, once in reference to the past history of Indian architecture, and most tellingly in the statement that the construction of the railways was an engineering marvel that revolutionized the economy of the country, catapulting it overnight from a medieval nation into the industrial era. The building's function as a railway station and the novelty within India of the Gothic style position it as a token of colonial modernization presented in the peculiarly upbeat way that marks the authorized heritage discourse. The role of Indian craftspeople in carving the decorative elements on the building's facade is stressed, while little attention is given to what they carved: portraits of imperial officials, native plants and animals, and representations of what the British conceived as the 16 castes of India, class divisions that were significantly hardened in the service of the colonial project. The enshrinement of India's contribution of labor and of natural resources positions it as a colonial subject, not as an equal partner. At the same time, the CSMT, as it is now abbreviated, has become part of the terroir of Mumbai, so that there has been a strong impulse outside the authorized heritage discourse, which continues colonialist ideas, obviously, to reclaim its Indianness by contesting its position as a projection of English and European identity and modernity in a less developed world. The physical space of the terminus has been little altered as part of this decolonizing project, aside from a statue of Queen Victoria having been removed sometime in the late 1940s or early 1950s. Rather, the contestation of the space has been discursive, beginning with the change of its eponym from Victoria to Chhatrapati Shivaji, a 17th century Maratha ruler, more recently used as an emblem of resistance to both British and Mughal imperialism, and unfortunately as a symbol of Hindu nationalism. However, the colonial past remains inscribed on the site, even in its official UNESCO designation, which reads Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus, formerly Victoria Terminus. The title of a book published to commemorate the building of this inscription on the UNESCO list also manifests this awareness of a contestation yet in progress. A city icon, Victoria Terminus, Bombay, 1887, now Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus, Mumbai, 1996. The authors, Rahul Mehrotra and Shara Dwivedi, conclude their book with an explicit contestation of the space's identity, writing that the terminus, built as an icon of modernity and the transformative effect that colonial power was seen to symbolize in India, today in its association in the city of Mumbai and for most citizens, is not even remotely aligned with its original intent. This categorical statement of a discursive conquest of a contested space, however, is immediately equivocated with the double-edged acknowledgement that in contemporary Mumbai, while VT has been internalized in the urban memory of its inhabitants as an icon of the legacy of British rule in India, it is more importantly seen as the gateway to the city. Later, they construe the outcome of the contestation of the terminus as open-ended, asking, what is the new meaning of the building in the emergent landscape of Mumbai? Their suggestion for further uses are tentative. Could the ground floor of the terminus administrative building be dedicated to public uses, such as a museum on the history of the city or one on the history of the railways in the city, or perhaps accommodate a public relations office that assists commuters and tourists, and do not decisively wrest the meaning of the space from its colonial symbolism? A more compelling vision for contesting the meaning of the space emerges in a children's book published as part of a UNESCO World Heritage Sites of India series. Subhahi Jiwani's Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus, Traveling Through Time, focuses on Bandhu, who maintains the station's many antique clocks, and his attempt to help two children, Lali and Mitu, understand the significance of the building by manipulating time, taking the children to visit three moments in the history of the terminus. The first, in 1880, also emphasizes the role of Indian craftspeople in sculpting the building's figures, though it underlines the power hierarchy extant at the time by quoting the sculptor telling the griffin that he is sculpting, "Today I long to see my children. I had to leave them behind in my village in Telangana and come to the city to work. Ah, life, why must it be so difficult?" The next moment whisks the children to the year 1942, discursively contesting the meaning of the space by associating it with Gandhi passing through it on his way to prison at Pune, and so locating it as a site of resistance rather than colonial power. In the book's third and most striking episode, Bandhu takes Lali and Mitu into the future, to the year 2500, where the statue of the griffin and all the building's sculptural elements can speak for themselves over, quote, wireless networks and fly about in, quote, the virtual zone. The children themselves can fly in the virtual zone, flight as ever symbolizing freedom, and soar to the clock room where all the building's sculptures and portraits dance together, the sculpted animals alive and the sculpted vines putting forth leaves. This vision of a technological future that will somehow reconcile the colonial past with a post-colonial future is at first glance naive, but in a sense, it is an inverse medievalism, a cancellation of a modernity that sundered colonies from their own pre-modern pasts by the vision of an idealized future. While medievalist spaces within the West involve a dialogue of past and present, in the former colonies, the dialectic is between the present and the future.
The intersections of past, present, and future, and indeed of nonlinear transcendent time, are essential to both Ryan Coogler's 2018 film Black Panther and Marlon James's novel Black Leopard, Red Wolf. In both instances, Africa's medieval past must be reconstrued in the present in order for there to be a future separate from imposed colonial narratives. James interlaces fictional places, narrative styles, maps, and timescapes as his hero Tracker searches for the mysterious boy, while both T'Challa and Killmonger visit the mystical place of the ancestors as part of their coronation rituals with very different effects, a place which is supposed to integrate their present reigns with the Wakandan past. And I'm just going to skip some stuff about Marlon James because I think we're short on time. The Afro past of James's novel might thus be seen as a narrative ancestor of Afrofuturism, as represented in the Marvel Cinematic Universe's Black Panther, in which the highly sophisticated country of Wakanda develops a completely separate from the colonial spaces of African history, embodying similar historical rituals and narratives to what James creates in its connection to its own past. Indeed, the film opens with a disembodied child's voice asking, "Father, tell me a story, the story of home." The voiceover narrates the history of Wakanda and its unification, and notes that when the world around it descended into chaos, Wakanda closed its borders and hid from the rest of the world. The montage of chaos starts with a slave ship and continues on to World War I and II airplanes. Clearly, chaos is the product of colonialism. The cloaking device that hides the capital city of Wakanda leaves visible only what the West believes Africa to be: impoverished, primitive subsistence farms, nothing of value to exploit. As a result, unlike its neighbors, Wakanda is able to create, preserve, and sustain a direct history from its medieval past to present. Unlike the history of the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, the film suggests, Wakanda can both maintain its own sacred past traditions, the heart-shaped herb that conveys the power of the Black Panther, an avatar of the Egyptian god past, the King Challenge ceremony, the Dora Milaje, an Amazonian warrior guard, unique alphabet, fighting rhinoceri, while simultaneously producing a highly advanced technology thanks to their ability to mine and use vibranium, the world's strongest element that also conveys certain kinds of magical power. These seem in part drawn from the Malian epic, the Sunjata, archaeological finds from the medieval period in Africa, folk tales, mythologies, for instance, the Jabari mysteriously worship Hanuman, the Hindu monkey god, and artifacts like the golden rhinoceros. The intersections of time and space are embodied in the ritual by which Prince T'Challa ascends the throne. After successfully fighting off M'Baku from the Jabari tribe, T'Challa undergoes a restoration ritual which sends him to the ancestral land where he is able to commune with his dead father, a place that Killmonger later experiences very differently in his own temporary ascent to the Wakandan throne. Conflict arises over whether Wakanda should remain hidden and isolated, or whether it should use its power and wealth to empower the African diaspora. Eric Killmonger, the film's villain, believes that Wakandan technology should be turned into weapons shared with Black people throughout the diaspora to allow them to rise up and conquer Western oppression. Killmonger first appears as an adult when he liberates a Wakandan artifact from the Museum of Great Britain. The museum is an image of colonialist appropriation. A white docent lectures Killmonger on the African art he is looking at, misnaming several artifacts and insisting that her knowledge of them is more accurate than his. Ironically, the appearance of Wakanda on the list of the United States Department of Agriculture website as a free trade partner in late 2019 underscores this ignorance of Africa. This event ends in significant slaughter and is a microcosm of Killmonger's view of how to overthrow colonial power. However, it also shows the difficulties of breaking free from colonialist oppression, as Killmonger is working with Ulysses Klaue, a white South African, clearly chosen to represent the most egregious example of Western imperialism on the continent. Killmonger does kill Claw to use his body as an entree into Wakanda, but also shoots his own girlfriend in the process because she's in the way. One of the first examples of how diasporic Africans, the movie suggests, are separated from their own medieval past and can thus project only a future that replicates colonialism's senseless violence. Killmonger's inability to recognize the importance of an unbroken history causes him to turn his violence on the medieval parts of Wakandan ritual, burning the heart-shaped herb, and in his own voyage to the land of the ancestors, returning to his own childhood in Oakland instead of the unified Wakandan past. A different response is put forward by Nakia, T'Challa's sort of girlfriend, who at the start of the film has left Wakanda to help free women from enslavement by a Boko Haram-like army in Nigeria. She suggests that Wakanda is strong enough to provide aid to others who have nothing, the position the film ultimately adopts. The diplomatic and socially conscious way to share Wakandan technological resources triumphs over Killmonger's revolution, as the final scene returns to Oakland where the film began, with T'Challa and Shuri looking at the future Wakandan Outreach Center, which Shuri and Nakia will run. The choice to make Wakanda the site of Earth's stand against Thanos in Avengers Infinity War, and the appearance of T'Challa, the Dora Milaje, and Shuri at the final battle of Avengers Endgame shows that Wakanda has chosen a fully participatory option in the fight to save the universe. Yes?
Are you with us?
Yes. Yes. Okay. That Wakanda is the only army to appear in the final battle against Thanos emphasizes its place as a futuristic civilization advanced beyond the world's contemporary northern hegemons. Kugler and James's Afrofuturism, then, is dependent on a direct line from the medieval past, since their history and culture remain their own, and all choices of what remains is what is laid aside are their own. The slogan Wakanda Forever is dependent on being able to look backwards to an alternative history, one not governed by Western colonialism, the slave trade, and environmental destruction. As one of my students from Ghana said in my global medieval literature class, the Middle Ages was the last time we had our own history. So how does a medievalist discourse accommodate the exploration of these pressing contemporary issues of colonization, the displacement of peoples, and ultimately the trauma and grief they cause? The Middle Ages seems to be the place to turn to investigate the contestation of space and its results, even the colonial space that signifies the end of the period. Medievalism allows this multivocality because it lacks authoritative interpreters and is therefore open to a series of fantasies of varying kinds that allow explorations of the present that do not depend on coherence or factuality. They allow certain kinds of ambiguity to remain present in their arguments, the intersection of past, present, and future, and of fantasy elements with real problems, which allow medievalism to make sense. The world of global medievalisms potentially reflects the Middle Ages itself, a world without any single center of power, and with many differing ideologies and structures that offer both exchange and conflict, influence and contestation. What ties these spaces together is the contestation of modernity from a constructed medieval space, although what constitutes the modern and the medieval are fluid, varying from one instantiation to the next, whether those instantiations involve different national histories, different genres, or different ideological goals within a single category. Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Terminus, Black Leopard, Red Wolf, and Black Panther demonstrate a use of medievalism that works to undo its ties to a larger Western colonialist project, instead optimizing the tropes of medievalism's contesting of space as a methodology to create a narrative devoid of colonialist interest, a past that reaches back beyond the intrusion of the West while maintaining the same epic speed. On a global stage, medievalism can become not a tool of the colonialist oppressor, but a weapon in its opposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Robert. It's just a quick warning, and my internet seems to be a bit unstable now, so if I drop, someone else will take up moderation, don't worry. Our next panelist is Professor Dan Klein from the University of Alaska, Anchorage in the United States. Dan?
Can everyone hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, let me just get my screen situated. Let's see. First of all, while I'm getting everything set up here, can everyone see the PowerPoint here?
Yes, we can.
Okay. First of all, let me say thank you so much to Louise for putting this this conference together. It's such a treat to meet and talk with scholars all over the globe, and especially those, at least for me, from the Southern Hemisphere, and also those who were involved in other kinds of analysis and discussions. And I want to just kind of preface my comments by saying a lot of this comes out of my experience of being in Alaska, and Alaska is a place that changes you. You can't you can't negotiate with it. It will do what it will in things like the daylight and the darkness, the cold, and those kinds of things in ways that I hadn't otherwise experienced. And so it also is on the forefront of a number of different issues concerning colonialism, decentering whiteness, decentering the Western narrative, other things that have already come up. And I've already learned 2 or 3 things that are going to force me to rethink everything I've already thought to this point. So I'm really tickled to be here and to talk more with you. And I want to begin then with something that we started doing in Anchorage several years back. And a lot of people criticize this as an empty gesture, but it's not that here at UAA. And that's to acknowledge that we are colonialists. We are resident on the traditional ancestral homelands and unceded homelands of the Dena'ina Athabascan, the Atna Athabascan, the Alutiiq and Sugpiaq peoples, and the Eyak peoples. And we acknowledge the 20 officially recognized Alaska Native languages that are the state languages of Alaska itself. And we have been doing different institutional things to bring the Alaska Natives experience more clearly into our institutional lives. So just a little bit of context here. Alaska's big, especially compared to the other parts of the United States. And I did find some comparison as well with Brazil. And you'll notice that not only is it large, it's ecologically very, very different. So what we call the Panhandle, which is that part that extends down into the Pacific Northwest, is a temperate rainforest, and then all the way up into what we call the North Slope, or the Inupiaq, or the old-fashioned term was Eskimo, and we don't use that. Very, very different. And I would love to talk more about the diversity in Brazil as well, because I think there are some comparisons there. And so the types of lives that people live in Alaska are also very, very different. Anchorage is also very diverse. A lot of people don't realize that Anchorage is one of the most, if not the most diverse city in the US. One of our demographers established based on the 2010 census, that the single most diverse zip code in the US, which is a postal code, is in a neighborhood in North Anchorage. In the Anchorage school district last year, there were 102 languages spoken in the district. 8 of the 10 most diverse elementary schools in the US are in Anchorage, 4 of the 5 most diverse high schools. So diversity is part of who we are in Alaska. And so what I'm going to talk about, and what I've been even prefacing here, is really about how Alaska has changed me, both as an individual and as a scholar, and how I've unlearned a lot of things in a really profitable way by listening to my colleagues and to my Alaska Native students. So there are going to be 4 parts here. And I wanted to start with a different place. I wanted to come to something different in talking about these issues of indigeneity, medievalism, and that is to not begin as much as possible with a theoretical approach. I think when we bring theory to a text or to an issue, we're doing another kind of colonial exercise, right? We're imposing this thing. And I began to get dissatisfied with that. So I looked around, I listened to my students and colleagues, I started letting go, and hopefully I'm beginning to learn some new kinds of things here. So first of all, looking. I took these two pictures, and so I get to show that off a little bit too. But right across what's called the Cook Inlet in Alaska, right, there's Captain Cook, even though Alaska Native peoples had been here for 12 to 14,000 years. It's Captain Cook who gets the credit. Can you see this mountain here? That's Mount Susitna, or what has been called the Sleeping Lady. And if you look, you can almost see the outline of a person's body laying either on her side or on her back. And so one of the first stories I was told when I arrived in Anchorage, oh, do you know the story of the Sleeping Lady, Mount Susitna? I said, well, no, I don't. Well, it's a story, it's an old story of an Alaska Native princess, which is a term, of course, they would not have known or used, who fell in love with her prince, and he went off to war. And in her pining for him, she laid down and fell asleep and was covered with soil and flowers. And when he comes back from war, she will arise and they will be reunited. And I thought, oh yeah, that's really nice. You know, I'd been educated in etiological stories, right? Mythical stories. It made perfect sense to me. It's from a white woman's child story back in the 20s. It's not it at all. It's called the Glishla, or the Sacred Mountain to the Dena'ina Athabascan. And it's actually called, in some phrases, the Small Mountain, because it's contrasted with Denali, which everyone knows is the big mountain. And so when I first was corrected, I thought, oh my gosh, what else am I missing? What else am I getting wrong? Well, Shem Pete was, as I listened to my, especially my Alaska Native colleagues, I worked for 3 years as director of general education here at UAA, and that's a part of the US undergraduate curriculum. It took 3 years, but we were able to initiate what is probably the first Indigenous studies requirement in general education for any public institution in the US that's not part of a globalization or a multicultural initiative. So every student coming through any Alaska institution has to take at least a single course that centers upon Alaska Native experiences. And again, 20 different recognized entities. So it's not just a singular Alaska Native experience. And a colleague of mine let me know about Shem Pete's Alaska. And this was an anthropological study in which an older Dena'ina Athabascan man, an elder, was interviewed to learn the place names of what's known as the Upper Cook Inlet, which is where Alaska is situated. And you can find it online. And Shem Pete basically said, if you know the language, you can survive in this environment. And that's consistent for all of the Alaska Native languages that I know about. So the Dena'ina naming system is consistent, conservative, and stable. It has persisted over thousands of years. And it's also tied then to seasonal migration and especially food availability. So you won't find indigenous populations, at least in Alaska and probably many other places, naming something after a person because that wasn't valuable. It didn't help you identify what you needed to survive. So the Cook Inlet was called Duty. That's the salt water. Ship Creek, which was renamed when Anchorage was founded, that was Stickleback Creek because that's where the stickleback fish could be found at a certain period during the year. Whiskey Lake, which is just a little bit up the road, had a different kind of um, availability for food. That's where we spend the spring, because certain berries and other things are available. The Talkeetna River, which is a much larger river, somewhat north, food is stored river. That was a river that was powerful enough to not freeze completely. And so the Dena'ina peoples could store food in different holders and keep it preserved through either the winter or the summer, depending on what they were harvesting. Helene Lake, something is clubbed in it. The fish were so, salmon were so prevalent, the 5 different salmon that spawn, you just walk in and you bonk them and you have enough food to get you through the winter. So as I began to think about this, not only does it begin to decenter this Western narrative, it actually gets us to something before Greco-Roman conceptualization began to break things down. And that became very important to me, to listen to the land and to the people. So the listening, 3 stories, I'll just tell you one. And that is, as I began up in Alaska in 1997, coming fresh with my PhD, my Alaska Native students, again, which I had not known too much about, reacted in the most fascinating ways to medieval literary texts and in ways that I wasn't familiar with. So for the students who came from the interior peoples, the Dena'ina Athabascan, Atna Athabascan, and others in Inupiaq, Beowulf was, they had a completely unique take on Beowulf. They too lived in clan houses that were segregated by males and females. And it took me a while to sort of understand that they were teaching me something about their culture rather than me saying, oh no, you've got it wrong, right? No, this is no, actually, I think they probably are closer in some ways to that life than I ever was. Spectacular. I wish I was smart enough to have interviewed or taken better notes, but I do that now as I'm able to teach these courses. Then the seagoing peoples. So especially the Haida, Tsimshian, Sugpiaq, you would be amazed at the way they react to the seagoing tales, like the Seafarer and the Wanderer. Wonderful stuff. To hear Alaska Native students talk about the Man of Law's tale, the Wife of Bath's tale, the Physician and the Prioress, about different relationships. Very, very interesting. So I began to listen to them. And so I started blowing up my curriculum, my courses. And I would begin with something like the Lays of Marie de France and ask students to then rewrite it according to Alaska Native insights, or to interview somebody and to bring those insights to the class. And then my history of criticism, that's over here on this side. I had a wonderful, purely Eurocentric examination of literary theory from Socrates to Day Before Yesterday. Now we blow it up. I bring in the last unit, we do things like Linda Toohey Smith's decolonizing methodologies and those kinds of things, where we take these Eurocentric ideas and show how really provincial they are. I love that. Professor Uchoa, I love that idea of decentering and provincializing Europe. Does everyone know the turn toward things, right? Thing theory? You should hear Alaska Native students, or those who live subsistence lifestyles, hoot at the arrogance of these texts. Because if you live a subsistence lifestyle, there is no waste. Everything is valuable. Everything has a spirit or a possibility. So it's been wonderful in decentering those things. And I know I'm coming up to the end here. So finally, oh gosh, and there's so much here, and I think with Brazil and Alaska, I think there are a lot of parallels, because in Alaska, we're still dealing with not just the memory of historical trauma and colonial violence, but we are still experiencing it. And I know that indigeneity in Brazil, you're dealing with very similar kinds of things. So finally, the place-based medievalism that I've been working toward is built on a different set of assumptions. As PhDs, we're often kind of in an Oedipal struggle with previous generations of scholarship. We have to overthrow them. That's not the way Alaska Native cultures work. You respect your elders, you listen to them, you work with them, you take from their memory. So it's communal, it's relational, it's reciprocal. And what I hope to do is to get to a phenomenology of story that is not conditioned by the Greeks or by Christianity, to a place where my students can take medieval stories to Alaska Native communities and come back. And then finally, if I were to have a theoretical orientation, I'm so sick of Plato, I could just be sick of Plato. Emmanuel Levinas is someone who I think is more congenial to many of these ideas in which the face approaches us and calls us into an ethical relationship. And I just had to add a meme because I think memes are the most medieval thing about modern Western culture. So that's it. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dan. I would like to present our final panelist for this session, which is Professor Stephen Basdo from the Richmond American International University in England.
Thank you, Louis, and thank you to all previous speakers. I'm just going to share my screen. 2 seconds. There we are.
Yeah, I just turned mine off. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. 2 seconds. All right. Paper's titled The Teaching of British Medieval History in British Guyana Schools During the 1950s and 1960s. So, the rise of the English and, after 1707, British Empire is a well-told tale. Eventually, the empire covered 1/4 of the world's surface. The focus of this paper is the former British colony Guyana, the only colony that the British had on the South American mainland, and a poem written by the Guyanese-born John A. Gard, who was born in the 1940s, titled Checking Out Me History in 2004. The poem offers a fascinating but fleeting glimpse into the teaching of medievalism in the colony schools prior to independence in 1966. I shall supplement A. Gard's testimony with oral reminiscences from my own father, Joseph Basdale, who was born in British Guyana and educated in its British quote-unquote school system. Although the paper elucidates the reminiscences of only 2 men, recorded at a distance of many years in different forms, a poem and an interview, I hope that a brief but meaningful contribution to a discussion surrounding decolonization of medievalism can be made, because from my own reading and my own research, the reception of medieval history among subject peoples of the various European colonies is something of a blind spot in many recent calls for decolonizing the field. As I show in this paper, the teaching of seemingly harmless medieval events and legendary figures was often viewed, or has been viewed in later life by these 2 men, as kind of imperialist propaganda. So I'll begin with a brief history of Guyana's colonial era educational policy to contextualize colonial schools' teaching of British medieval history. Now, England and Guyana's relationship dates to when Walter Raleigh, seeking to find El Dorado, sailed to the region in the 1590s. No permanent colony was established at this point, however. Instead, in 1621, the Dutch East India Company first established sugar plantations in the region and introduced African slaves into the region. To attract investment, the Dutch also invited British merchants to settle in the region. Guyana by the 18th century was a Dutch colony then, but in which indigenous Arawaks, black slaves, and European merchants were found. After the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, part of Dutch Guyana was ceded to the British Empire, and the colony was renamed British Guyana. Having abolished the slave trade in 1807 and 1833, and unable to rely on slaves from Africa, the British brought workers from India to work on plantations, and so you have another ethnicity arrived in the region. From 1814, the government pursued a largely laissez-faire approach to educating Guyanese children and allowed missionaries to establish schools. After the abolition of slavery in 1833, the British took a more active role in educating the children in the colonies in the hope of creating an obedient working class. The result was the Negro Education Act of 1834, which applied in all British Caribbean colonies. Education until 11 years of age, provided by missionary societies who designed the curriculum, became compulsory. And this was the state of affairs largely throughout the entire 19th Victorian period after that, until the 1920s, when the British government took direct control of setting the curriculum. Now, the curriculum from the 1920s onward included the 3 R's, reading, writing and arithmetic, as well as British history, geography and the sciences. All textbooks were printed in the United Kingdom. It's actually difficult to find old Guyanese school textbooks because of their ephemeral nature. They were mainly exercise books with printed questions on, but I did manage to find a picture from a school on the screen of a Guyanese school and obviously 2 teachers marking the work. It was in the school system outlined above that John Agard was taught. Having moved with his father to London in 1977, he embarked upon a literary career. 2 of Agard's poems, Checking Out My History, the focus of this paper, and another one called Half Caste, are featured as the set text on the poetry section on the English Literature GCSE examination in the UK. Checking Out My History is a poem in which Agard recalls what he was taught at school and how this has affected his personal and national identity. It is written in a Caribbean dialect, which is a deliberate act of rebellion against the language imposed on him by British colonisers. There is no regular rhyme scheme either. This is not a European poem in any sense. And you can see the opening of the poem on the screen. Dem tell me, what dem want to tell me. Bandage up me eye with me own history. Blind me to me own identity. Dem, them, as my father also pronounces the word them, are the British educators that Agard had. There's a belligerent them and us attitude. Although I should point out that Agard's educators would not necessarily have been white and British. By the 1950s, as my own father points out, both Guyanese people and Europeans served as school teachers. For Agard, however, the curriculum imposed on Guyanese children was Anglo-centric, and this blinded Agard to the realisation of his own history and identity, as said in the poem. Now, the entire theme of Agard's poem is, in fact, a search for identity and reconnecting with his people's lost, quote-unquote, history. The teaching of several aspects of English medieval history, fairy tales and folklore are responsible for having obscured Agard's Caribbean identity. Indeed, it was mostly a childish medievalism that Agard was taught. He makes reference to several events and people, 1066 and all that, Dick Whittington and he cat, how Robin Hood used to camp, and of how old King Cole was a merry old soul. Agard's use of 1066 and all that is an allusion to the date of the Norman conquest, a key point in English history, which English primary schools pupils are still taught. Agard's use of and all that should be read as him being dismissive of the Norman conquest and other events from early English history. There was no reason why a Guyanese child like Agard, or indeed my father, needed to be taught about 1066, or indeed any event in early English history. This was a sentiment echoed by E. Wynne Williams, a colonial administrator in Guyana, who remarked upon the pointlessness of teaching, quote, the anarchy of Stephen's reign or the religious difficulties of Queen Elizabeth to Guyanese pupils in the 1920s. Agard also felt patronised by the teaching of some aspects of English medieval history. And he singles out here Dick Whittington and his cat. Richard Whittington was in fact a real historical person, but the legend of him selling a cat whose home was rat infested to a family whose home was rat infested and thereafter getting rich is entirely fictional. If Agard learnt Whittington's legend in his youth, then it would have been unimportant and largely irrelevant to such a Guyanese pupil. The same goes for his learning of Old King Cole. Excuse me. Most interesting for medievalism scholars, however, is Agard's recollection of having been taught about the outlaw Robin Hood. Agard declares that "Dem tell me about Florence Nightingale and she lamp, and how Robin Hood used to camp." Robin Hood stories were taught to Guyanese school children in history lessons during the 1930s and 1940s, just the same as English school children learned them. Now, modern Robin Hood scholars contend that the outlaw story represents, and indeed celebrates, as Stephen Knight says, justice, resistance to oppressive authority, and that the central values of the tradition of the good outlaw are liberty and equality, according to Stephen Knight. And one of the main attractions of the Robin Hood story for Western audiences is the fact that he stole from the rich and gave to the poor. However, Agard attributes no great or heroic deeds to Robin Hood, and we are only told that, in a basic tone, he used to camp. Instead, the retelling of the outlaw story in British Guyana was a tool of colonial propaganda. The outlaw may have served as an emancipatory figure in Anglo-American culture, but to Agard in Guyana during the 1950s, Robin Hood's presence in the colony was as an imperialist English figure. To cement Robin Hood's credentials, he is of course paired with Florence Nightingale, the allegedly saintly lady with the lamp who cared for sick soldiers in Balaclava during the imperialist Crimean War. So, when Agard was taught about Robin Hood, the outlaw's legend was a part of the overall British system of education and propaganda that was foisted upon the Guyanese. The real symbols of resistance to unjust authority for Agard was not a remote English outlaw living in a medieval forest, but the likes of Nanny de Maroon, who fought a guerrilla war against the British colonialists in Jamaica with the help of escaped slaves, or the aforementioned Toussaint Louverture. My father had a generalized recollection of the history he was taught, but Agard's poem is different here. In Agard's poem, as we have seen, Robin Hood is coupled with the Victorian imperialist Florence Nightingale, or imperialist figure. He also is dismissive of the medieval Dick Whittington, but he does speak glowingly of Toussaint Louverture. But the fact that all these figures from kind of medieval figures alongside Victorian British figures, the fact that they are often spoken of in the same lines in the poem shows that Agard doesn't actually care for the standard periodization of history that is undeniably Euro and American centric. We noted earlier as well that Agard was dismissive towards much of European history, although much of what he recounts was folklore, and this reflects the increasing ambivalence that Caribbean writers in recent years have manifested over European colonization, not only of their land, but also of their history. Intellectuals and cultural leaders from the region, songwriters, poets, novelists, have attempted to recover what they see as a lost, quote-unquote, ancestral culture. But this can only ever be a partial rebellion. For while Agard makes brief references to the Caribs and Arawaks, the people whom he really admires are in fact modern figures. Toussaint Louverture was inspired by that modern European event, the French Revolution, and sought to extend its principles to the Haitian people. It is not controversial to state that without the European ideals of liberty, as they were enshrined in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, there might have been no Haitian Revolution. As Simon Gakandi states of other Caribbean writers, in the poem, Agard can be opposed to the Eurocentric idea of history, but he can never truly be independent of it. Agard charges his British educators with not having taught him about the history of the indigenous people of Guyana. As he says, quote, "But what happened to the Caribs and the Arawaks too," end quote. My father's testimony differs from Agard in this respect, for although Agard does not recall having been taught about the Arawaks, my father did. But British Guyana was ethnically diverse. And one of the problems for the British was deciding what to teach the children of such disparate ethnic groups. The colony's racial or ethnic breakdown can be seen on screen. And although my father recollects having been taught Arawak history and other aspects of Caribbean history, there was very little effort on the part of the British colonial authorities to shape, through education and the creation of a common culture, the various ethnicities into one Guyanese nation. Agard identified as Afro-Guyanese, but when questioned, my father foregrounded his Indian heritage. Where Agard wishes he had been taught about Toussaint Louverture instead of Old King Cole, there is no reason to suppose that a child of Indian descent in British Guyana may necessarily have found Toussaint's story inspiring. Researchers in the field of curriculum studies have concluded that within nation states like the UK, the question of what should be taught in schools is usually decided through consensus between voters and politicians.
Stephen, your time is up, so if you could please conclude.
Oh, just 2 more minutes. But where this consensus is absent, much like in colonial societies, the question of what is taught is obviously shaped by the wishes of the dominant group. English medieval history, therefore, remained on the Guyanese syllabus. Now, the brief paper has attempted to give some insight into how medieval history was taught in the colony of Guyana, but for Agard, decolonization, or the decolonization of his own identity and history, essentially has amounted to a repudiation. Thank you, and apologies for running over. I didn't realize I did that.
Oh, no worries. So thank you all for your great presentations. I think this has been a terrific panel so far. So let's open for questions. We already have a raised hand. As a reminder, you can raise your hand down there. You can submit your question through Q&A, or you can type your question in the chat. All alternatives work, and if you raise your hand or if you say so in the chat, I can give you permission to speak and appear. Thank you. Okay, let's see. We have one raised hand. Why is it not showing yet? Okay. Leandro, question? You can talk.
Sorry, I was mute. I'm dumb. And in any case, thank you all for this wonderful, marvelous table. All the good adjectives can be fitting here. It was really enlightening. All sessions were great, and to not monopolize the time, I have 2 questions, one for Professor Bruno and one for Professor Klein. Bruno, I really liked your presentation. I liked the way that you somewhat dissected hidden, I don't want to say agenda, but hidden thought in Goody's work. And I'd like to ask that if you can see a certain quote unquote disdain for medieval Europe and the concept of Middle Ages as a whole, and if you can perceive it, is tied to an overly adoration of progress. I am currently reading the Renaissance book, The Renaissance by Goody. I haven't read The Theft of History yet. And in the Renaissance, I can really see somewhat of a hatred that Goody has towards European Middle Ages. If you could talk about that. And Professor Klein, I really loved your presentation. It's lovely how you showed us how Middle Ages or a part of Middle Ages is perceived by people that had no Middle Ages. It's especially important, your talk for Brazil, that there's a sector of historians that are trying to eliminate medieval history and also ancient history, modern history, etc., from curriculums from both schools and also universities, saying that they are a colonizer's history, that they are not important, and that we should focus on Brazilian history, not realizing that they are reproducing a colonialist discourse by themselves. But in any case, the question I have for you is more of a curiosity, that if you know how these different people that you teach history, how do they understand the concept of time and the time flow? And if you perceive that there's different conceptions of time, if you have tried to incorporate your classes, the way that you teach the medieval history, to better access or to better mold their, as Jürgen Huizen would say, historical consciousness. And thank you. I hope I have made myself clear.
Bruno, go ahead. They're two different questions. So why don't you go ahead and let me think about time.
Bruno? I think Bruno is not with us anymore. He must have dropped from the connection at some point. Okay. Well, we'll wait for him to return, so you can go ahead, Dan.
Well, I needed more time to consider time, but I have thought about that a little bit, and actually in relationship to the pandemic. I don't know about y'all, but my sense of time over the last 15, 18 months is completely distorted. It's still March 2020, but it's the 386th day of March or something like that, because the normal markers, right, that show the passage of time have been altered in my experience. And one of the things, when I started by mentioning how Alaska changes you, right? There's no, you can't negotiate with this environment, right? If you're not ready for it, it'll kill you. That's a very different kind of experience than in many places in the lower 48, which can be dangerous in different ways. And so the cycle of daylight and darkness is paramount up here. I don't think in terms of seasons or even calendars too much anymore. I think in terms of the movement, and you can think of the sine wave, right, from the solstice to the equinox to the solstice to the equinox. That's really what matters. So even though in the northern hemisphere we're supposed to be in spring, we aren't here in Alaska. And so it's that cycle of the seasons that's tied to the daylight and the darkness that is important. And so in my reading and discussion with my Alaska Native colleagues, calendars were not a thing. What the elders learned were the signs of the season that would tell you when it was time to move to the fish camp to gather fish, when the berries were available, right? And that depended upon being sensitive to the environment in a way that we have forgotten because we've been insulated from the environment in so many different ways. And so that experience of time is not a linear thing, I think, in the same way as it is in Western culture, but it's a cyclical, a recursive kind of thing. And so that's one dimension, that it's tied to subsistence and living. You have to be at the right place at the right time with the right technologies or you're going to die because you won't have food for across the winter. And the elders kept that knowledge. So the time is relational. And then the second piece of that is the time is embodied, right? It's not a separate thing, a calendar, right, that you refer to. It's part of the warp and woof of your life. And I think that's something, again, thinking especially about early English literatures, things like Beowulf and some of those older texts. I think the experience of my Alaska Native students and colleagues is closer to whatever that lived experience was. And I'll just make one little other connection there. I've heard the term used lately about our dislocation of time as algorithmic time. We don't even have a calendar anymore because Facebook will feed back your memory 9 years ago. So we're constantly in this fragmented thing where something else is telling us what's meaningful for us at this moment, right? And it's determined by the black box of these algorithms, which are often driven by commercial concerns. And so, I don't know if that gets closer to some of your concerns. I haven't fully fleshed that out yet, but that is a really important dimension, that experience of time. And so again, history has a very, very different thing. And again, Plato, I want to get back before, in some way, in whatever way is possible, to before those conceptual splits started. And this is giving me a little bit of an insight. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question.
Thank you very much. And I imagine that because as I talked about Brazil, where people from their own historians are trying to get rid of medieval because they say it's not our past, it's not our time conceivings. And just seeing that your students that also have no Middle Ages, that have a different conception of time, they can arrive to conclusions that I don't want to say Western, but more Westernized. I don't believe Brazil and not even United States are West, but more Westernized. They can produce conclusions that Western medievalists could never hope to achieve.
Absolutely.
Thank you for your answer.
Can I tell one quick story?
Sure.
That again, no, I think you're really onto something. What are we missing? What am I missing as a traditional medievalist, but theoretically inclined and such? When I read these texts that are chronologically and geographically removed, the Franklin expedition was a big one of those efforts to find the Northwest Passage in the mid-19th century. And that was one of the stories that I didn't get to tell. And there was a big exhibition. Only 3 museums in the world had this gathering of Franklin memorabilia and scholarship, and we had that here in Anchorage a couple of years ago. And they were talking about there was a series of panelists, including experts, Western experts, and an Alaska Native, a colleague of mine, who heard stories from his grandmother. And he lived in Nome, which is the far west of Alaska, stories about the Franklin expedition that had happened 80 years earlier over near Baffin Island and all that. It had traveled. And one of the details that stuck with me was in the Inuit testimony, which again was denigrated, right? Oral tradition is not really history. Is that the Alaska Native elder, or the Inuit elder, who talked about meeting these human beings whose faces were bleached like a dead seal. They had no way of talking about a white person. One of the things that amazed them was that their hoods were not attached to their jackets. why would that matter? They had a separate hat and a hood. Well, if your hood's not attached in the deep Arctic, you'll be dead. If your head's uncovered, you'll die. And so something that was perfectly obvious to the Inuit elders, who would have taught a child, right? In fact, they didn't even make clothing that didn't have that for wintertime. And I just find myself thinking, what else have I not been able to attend to simply because of my cultural presuppositions? So just to come back to the Brazilian question, I think it's the same issue here in the US, getting rid of classics and humanities. And again, excuse me, I know I'm taking a lot of time. But those Western paradigms, they shape the world that we have to live in, right? Even if you're an indigenous person in the US or in Brazil. And so removing that heritage seems to me that it could have the opposite effect as well, that it could be filled in a vacuum by things that maybe were not as productive. So I'll be quiet now, thank you. I get excited.
Thank you, Dan. So Bruno, did you hear the question or not? Oh, okay. So in the meantime, I have a question which I think is pertinent for both Dan and Stephen, but I think specifically Dan because of what you're talking about, which is when you mentioned Beowulf, which is like here in Brazil during the early colonial period, the Jesuit priests from the Company of Jesus, their main method of evangelization here in Brazil was to teach the indigenous people in their native language, and at the same time incorporate some of their local mythology within Christian mythology. So because of that, some false parallels were created, like the idea of Tupã, which would be an old god for the native, which doesn't really existed. It was an attempt to create an equivalent to the Christian god. And at the same time, they did employ medieval literature translated as some means to colonize and to, I'm missing the word here, but it's catechism. So when you what is the word to catechize? That doesn't exist, does it?
Catechism, the accepted body of teaching. Yeah.
Yeah. So they did employ medieval literature for that. Is there any parallels we could trace to Alaska and Guyana? And I know we are all talking about different periods here, but still. Oh, the cat.
I think in Guyana's case, it's a big no, basically. I mean, it's, it's kind of, I mean, I raised it briefly in the talk itself. I mean, at first glance, it seems quite arrogant of the British colonizers. They've turned up in this country. They've made this territory. It's a kind of hodgepodge of various ethnicities and races, and so the best thing is, well, we can teach them a little bit about the kind of history of the Caribbean, but in the context of empire, and even in the 1930s and 1940s, the kind of focus for the British is really to build that loyalty to the empire, and so it's all about well, this is why you get the big focus on Britain, to be honest. So yeah, there's not the equivalent there, actually. It's there's no attempt to rework certain medieval instances of folklore and legend into, say, the Arawaks or Indians or people, or to the culture of people of African descent. So yeah, it's just arrogant, but I guess in the context of building loyalty to the kind of mother country and the fact that there are the kind of ethnic groups are just so disparate, then yes, you don't really get that.
So there isn't the idea to try to incorporate this medieval past as almost a common ground.
No, I mean, from kind of the research I've done so far, I mean, you know, these kids and even my dad, when he talks about it, they're very conscious that this is Britain's medieval history that we are learning, and that really that they will learn a bit about the kind of discovery of the Americas, quote unquote, but yeah, I mean, it is about looking to Britain. This is Britain's that we are learning, and yeah, so it's, I mean, it I guess it was effective to a certain extent as well, but just a different method to what the Spanish and Portuguese pursued.
Well, if you don't mind, I'd love to sort of turn that over maybe to that same question over to Bruno or to Angela or Robert, because I imagine there are parallels. There are some things in Alaska that maybe I could come around to, but it's wide open. It really hasn't been investigated in the way that you presented it. But I think you have some things to mention, but I wonder what the other contexts are as well.
Okay, Angela, do you want to follow up on that?
I can certainly try. I mean, I think the whole sort of project that I was talking about, and I think to some extent that Bob was talking about, and I apologize, he had to go teach. This is the problem with the virtual conference. When you're really still at home, you still have to teach your classes. You know, is an attempt to either recover or reclaim history, and you know that they're sort of different projects, that the reclamation of a colonialist object and kind of making it a non-colonialist object is what's going on with the terminus. And but I think in the two works that I talked about one and I didn't really the other, but there's some kind of sense that a history that is broken by a kind of colonialist project leaves people really disconnected and is a way of kind of not only disenfranchising, but also unrooting people so that they don't really have a kind of long-term sense of who they are and what they therefore could be. That it's not only a way of disrupting a past, but it also disrupts a future, because the narrative, the colonialist narrative, the history that's being taught to to John Agard and his ilk, or in any of these cases, or to the Alaska Native students, is a history that they don't belong to, and that their only place is as people who've been conquered, to whom they're supposed to be, being given light, or whatever that nonsense narrative is. And so it's sort of a perpetual opportunity for disenfranchisement and violence. And I think there's sort of the implication that one of the reasons that Killmonger can't see any kind of future that's not basically a kind of revolutionary act of destruction is that the only narrative he has is the colonialist act of destruction. So he just wants to copy those in the opposite direction. But that somebody who is fully connected to their history in an unbroken way has a different access to time that permits a kind of positive future. Because there's a past, there's a future, and because there's an almost time outside of time that is not constructed by these clocks, if you will, or by colonialist timekeeping measures or calendars or any of the things that you mentioned, that there's this opportunity to construct one's own future in a way that you choose, and that can be deeply enriching, as this kind of futurist narrative of Wakanda, that this perfect society where people can be both fully indigenous and wildly technological at the same time, because those two things are not constructed as an opposition to each other, is necessitated by having some access to that time before, that time when we had, last time we had our own history, as my student put it. I thought so interestingly, when we read the Sanjata, he was in my medieval lit class and we were reading the Sanjata, and he's from Ghana and said, well, that was the reason that the Middle Ages are important is that's the last time we had our own history. So not thinking about it as a particularly European history, but as their own history. And I think that connects to what Bruno was talking about with John Goody, who really sort of shows the way that Europe is not central in the medieval period, but is extremely peripheral to large world narratives, and occupies a kind of place at the end of the line. It's the end of the trade routes, the Silk Road and the spice roads. And we have constructed it as this kind of central important narrative, but really there are a lot of other much more important, much more central narratives that this Europeanizing has kind of tried to suppress, but they're ultimately really much more generative and important. Bruno, I'm serving the ball over to you.
So I didn't hear Dan Klein's question, but it's about teaching.
It's because I asked them about, I mentioned how during our colonial period here, some works of some literary works were used to create this idea of almost a common ground with medieval past, and also how the Jesuit utilized indigenous myths and Christianized them, such as the example of the old god Tupã. And then I asked if there were any parallels in Alaska and Guyana, and then then turned the question on teaching, and then it's back to you. I guess that sums up everything.
Yeah. So it's about how the colonial view of Brazilian indigenous people is on the classes. That's it? I didn't understand the point.
It can be. I think the point is how the medieval past was used or not used to during the colonial period. But I think that is also a great point you just mentioned there. So it can be both.
Yeah, that's because we in Brazil, we have a colonial period, but a colonial period that Europe was a periphery of the world. That's a point. But our colonial period was taken by a peripheral area from the Europe, Portugal. Portugal is the periphery of Europe. So it's an interesting thing because Iberia, it's the periphery of of Europe in Middle Ages. But when we came to Brazil, we sometimes do some kinds of connections of the European past, the Portuguese past, the Italian past, because we had a strong Italian migration, German past, because we had German migration in South, on Brazilian South. It's really common as some communities of supposed German people that are in Brazil. So what we have here in Brazil a colonized view of Middle Ages, that it's our Middle Ages because we were colonized by a peripheral world from an Europe that is also a peripheral of a wider world. So I think that teaching here in Brazil it's teaching Middle Ages in Brazil is really hard mission, because we had to decolonize Europe, provincialize Europe, but also to show that the past that we suppose that is ours, it's a past that is also provincialized in a also provincialized world. That is a problem of scales, of degrees, and it's a really interesting thing to thinking about. I don't know if I answered because I disconnected, and so.
If I could just jump in with the Alaska connection, I think one of the things that might distinguish Alaska, and that's such a good question, is we have to remember that Russia actually settled and contacted Alaska first. So it came from the east. And there's been some recent archaeological findings that made the news that Venetian beads from actually the fairly ancient beads were found at a site in northern Arctic Alaska. So there's that Eastern influence, and in fact, among some Alaska Native peoples, there was intermarriage, and so they'll have European or Russian names. And there's actually a group of Old Believers. There are 5 Old Believer communities in Alaska who split off from Russian Orthodoxy in the 17th century, and a number of those families came to Alaska to live undisturbed, and that's another fascinating issue. The idea of, again, using the medieval past as a common reference point for some kind of future, I'd have to think about that a little bit, because Alaska was divided up by 5 Protestant missionary groups by what's called the Comity Agreement in the mid-19th century. And basically, Presbyterians, Moravians, I can't remember all the details, in New York City decided that they're going to divide up Alaska so that they can evangelize, and so they wouldn't run into each other. But it was because they wouldn't have contractual problems with one another. So these groups divided Alaska. Sounds very much like what happened perhaps in Africa and other places, right? Decided how they were going to evangelize. So you would have an interesting overlay of the Protestant denial of medieval history, right? Of going back to some sort of pure religious thing, right? I was raised that way. There was Jesus, the apostles, 1,500 years of darkness, and then Luther, right? So you got this big gap, which also does all sorts of interesting things. But then, of course, it turned into the boarding school experience, right? In which basically it was, we're going to beat the native out of these people in order to turn them white, and we're still living with the historical trauma of that.
Thank you, Dan. So I would just, like, we're ending. We have like 5 minutes because I'm going to give an extra because we started a bit late. But I would just savage Leandro's question for Bruno and make it a broader question for everyone else. Is that okay with everyone? So everyone can give the brief answer, which is the concept of the Middle Ages as, like, I think we're all talking here about conflicting views of either disdaining the Middle Ages as this is the Europeans' past, bad, 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 which also ties with the Illuminist and liberal idea of progress sometimes that many of these colonial nations employed. So we need to be modern. And also another view, which some historians even defend, that is like, oh, Brazilians' past is Portugal's past because we are Portugal in America, we are the heirs of it. And so how do we deal with this conflicting nature of things? And how do we use the Middle Ages in a way that doesn't feed in either of those?
I wouldn't mind just starting on that. I mean, just to come back on your point, like Portugal's past is Brazil's past, was also a saying that the history of Britain is the history of the world, basically, because the empire was so large. I don't, and here's where I should really kind of craft my words carefully. I don't necessarily think that the study of the European medieval period, I mean, although in my talk I presented the case of a man who was obviously quite resentful, but I don't think that's the case for everyone. You know, I think sometimes we can over-theorize it. Sometimes we just want to study something for its own sake, and that is fine as well. You know, and so I remember when I was, you know, researching Wat Tyler a few years ago, and you know, my father just said, "Oh yeah, thank you, Louise." Yeah, and my father launched into this very enthusiastic kind of retelling of what he learned at school, and he's always liked that story, and you know, and I think it's as long as you kind of are sensitive towards like certain Eurocentric narratives of superiority, and you know, you're quick to debunk them. You know, I think, you know, let's spread the medieval period across the globe. Really, you know, as it should be. I mean, you know, it's I do think that for many people, to some extent, the history of European nations, because of their colonialism, the people in formerly subject territories do have some kind of claim to that heritage, but that probably was a bit rambling and didn't make a lot of sense.
Thank you. So who's next? Come on, talk show answers.
I'll jump in really quickly. I think the thing that I'm interested in is I came around to it as sort of blowing up my own paradigms, right, and trying to break up the conceptual frameworks that have limited me, right. I'll go back to Paul de Man, blindness and insight, right. You can know certain things, but it blinds you to other kinds of things. And what I found in listening to my students is I can continue to learn from them with very different conceptual categories that get me outside of my own and open up the text and the history and the thinking in brand new ways. And so the example I gave of Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter, and I don't want to belittle any scholars, but there's a section in there about trash. And my students who have lived a subsistence lifestyle would say, and she gives this long, a beautiful kind of explanation of, you know, the glories of trash and the animacy of things and all that. And my Alaska Native students were saying, hey, listen, when you're above the Arctic Circle in which there are no trees, you will take every piece of wood and you will find a use for it. You will take every piece of metal and you will find a use for it, right? There's no such thing as trash. And so again, this sort of for the West to come back and say, oh, look at all this stuff that's important. The Alaska Native students are saying, where y'all been? This is what it means to actually live in harmony with the land and with your environment. So the way I talk about it with students is, right, taking the theory and imposing it, that's criticism. But letting our experiences come back and take the criticism apart is critique. And that's what I'm interested in hearing from my students. It's like the detail about the hood. What else am I not seeing in these texts that I think I know so well? And that's come up over and over and over again. And it's really been glorious. It's really been a really positive thing. And the medieval is a place where some of those things can come together, I think.
Thank you, Dan. Angela?
I think for me, the revelation has been that there are a lot of Middle Ages. And I got this, and I want to give credit where it's due. I went to L'Anse Meadows, which is the Viking site in Atlantic Canada. And there was a very good film made by the Parks Canada, which talked about how when the Vikings crossed the North Atlantic, people were in contact all around the globe, which speaks to advanced Phoenician beads in a sense. And I think that was really revelatory for me. That the Middle Ages is not Europe; it's a lot of places. And if we just say, okay, it's a conventional term for the period between 500 and 1500, we can really look more broadly and teach much more broadly, and we can move beyond the idea that something has to be a written text to be teachable, too. That we can teach folk tales that get written down much later. I mean, the Sundiata was not written down in its own time, but has been passed down and is continued to be told by griots in Mali and in Ghana. So that's one example of, it's now put into a book, so it's easy to use. But I mean, next time I teach the course, I want to look at the city of Cahokia, which is an enormous city that was about 3 times bigger than London across the Mississippi from St. Louis, a Native American, well, presumably Native American city, although we don't know much about who occupied it. But just to let my students know that it's there, and that many things are going on in this period, not just Robin Hood or King Arthur or whatever it is, and really to stress for the kind of northern hemispheric Middle Ages, at least where I think we have the most evidence that's easy to get and use in a classroom, the interconnectedness of it all, that there are people talking to each other from Xi'an to Iceland, and that
I need to cut you because we are already 5 minutes into the next session. Bruno, the final words are yours.
Yes. Can I answer quickly in Portuguese? You translate to me?
Perfectly.
Okay. Então, para mim, a gente precisa, primeiramente, provincializar essa Europa, perceber como há outros, como estava dizendo a Ângela, outros lugares que estão convivendo com essa Europa ao mesmo tempo e que há conexões com essa Europa. Quer dizer, esses mundos se conectam entre si. A Europa, enquanto algo periférico, se conecta a um mundo muito maior. Então, é justamente pensar de uma forma global esse mundo medieval e que não necessariamente tomar a Europa como objeto não necessariamente tomar a Europa como objeto seja algo ruim. Não. E tal como não é simplesmente a gente deslocar o nosso olhar geográfico que a gente resolve o problema, mas é justamente de rever os moldes como a gente explica isso aos nossos alunos em sala de aula, pensar em outras estruturas narrativas, outras formas de narrar essas histórias. There was a question from Leandro, too.
Bruno, we really don't have the time. I just...
Okay.
I'm so sorry.
Sorry. No, okay.
So he says that first, the most important thing is to provincialize Europe and to recognize that other places in the world were also connected to Europe at that time, and that Europe was both center in some perspectives and periphery in others, and that it is connected peripherically to other places of the world. So the idea, the solution would be to think the world in a global form, and also he notes that taking Europe as the focus point is not necessarily bad, and also that ignoring Europe as the focus point isn't the solution either. The idea would be to create critical views on it. I think that sums what you said. Thank you, everyone. Sorry for ending this. I need to open the next table.